This is a review of Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 from the Cold War in the Americas book on the Cuban Revolution and Cuba in the Cold War by Haley Winder and Sabella Gaudioso.
To what extent was Castro's Cuban Revolution shaped by Cuban traditions rather than by communism? Castro's overthrow of Fulgencio Batista was the start of his reign. After 2 years, Castro announced his Marxist-Leninist following, and after this, Cuba became a Soviet satellite state. Many argue his overthrow of Batista was that of a communist revolution, but one possible theory is that it stems from Cuban tradition. During the 19th century, colonial Cuba was known to react with violent resistance, especially during the Spanish conquest, dating their tradition back to past revolutions, which also establishes this pattern of internal rebellion in the form of revolutions. However, despite this pattern of behavior, when Fidel came to power by his revolution, the Cuban Communist Party actually rejected the tradition of violence, while the anti-Batista revolution that aided Castro's rise to power was a big supporter. Not to mention, the 19th century also revealed Cuban nationalism through the revolts against the Spanish and their short-lived admiration for the U.S. after independence. During the late 19th century, America showed signs of domination and aggression, especially during their intervention within the Cuban War of Independence. Cubans soon realized America's plans of dominating their island and became very resentful, very fast. And this is what marks the tradition of resentment against the U.S. They gained a stranglehold over the Cuban economy. They inserted themselves into the Cuban Constitution by means of the Platt Amendment and entailing the U.S.'s right to intervene in Cuba for, quote, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberties, end quote. They gained control over Cuban foreign policy, and during the Batista governments, not much improved, so America continued to dominate the Cuban economy, and this Cuban nationalist tradition of anti-America fueled Castro's Cuban Revolution. Once Castro was in power, his anti-Americanism became even more pronounced. Even historian Richard Gott described Castro's Cuba as, quote, a communist country where nationalism was more significant than socialism. Another indication of Cuban tradition was their strong tradition of left-wing radicalism, especially during the early 20th century, as many Cuban workers often joined and supported socialist and communist groups. Despite the rise in numbers, the Cuban communists couldn't be credited to Castro's revolution, as they were never too influential. In fact, much of what they supported went against Castro's rise to power, seeing as they were hostile towards revolution in fear of U.S. intervention. They rejected sabotage as a means of getting rid of undesirable governments, and they also collaborated with Batista. Despite Castro's advocacy for a redistribution of wealth, he was not a member of the Communist Party, nor did he get on particularly well with them either. So Castro's anti-Batista revolution was not a communist one, it was precisely one of deep-rooted Cuban tradition.
The next review question is, how were Castro's domestic policies affected by the Cold War? What the Cold War did was encourage Cuba to economically gain support and aid from the USSR. The U.S. trade embargo and refusal to purchase Cuban sugar essentially pushed Cuba closer to the USSR, and after they adapted Sovietization, when they became a Soviet satellite, they began to follow the Soviet command economy model, which concentrated upon sugar production. The Soviets then funded Castro's social services in return, and Soviet support inevitably made Castro declare Cuba as a communist country and part of the Soviet bloc. Because Castro wanted to maintain independence from the U.S. during the Cold War, he also introduced many popular domestic policies, like his land redistribution policy, which won him support because basically when anti-Castro exiles returned to Cuba, they were able to reclaim their land, and that painted Castro as fair and just, because he even declared the expropriation of his own family farm. Not to mention, his social services were the best in Latin America, and his foreign policy reestablished Cuban nationalism, pride, and sense of identity. The war had another impact on domestic policies regarding Castro's intensified repression within Cuba. Castro was ruthless when necessary, like seeing the picture Fulgencio Batista, his predecessor, looks very happy. However, Castro actually happened to kill 500 of his supporters during his accession to power. He also developed several state organizations of repression, like a political police and a G2 and a secret service organized by the KGB, which was the Soviet secret service, and opposition groups and sabotagers were tracked down by CDRs, which were committees for the defense of the revolution. All in all, the Cold War had a great impact on Castro's domestic policies in conception, execution, and success.
How did Castro gain power? Apart from Castro's successful revolution, his rise to power is one of great importance, and as a young enthusiastic Cuban nationalist, his love for politics encouraged him to partake in political rebellion. He helped try to overthrow the US-backed dictator in the Dominican Republic. He participated in protests in 1948 at the Pan American Conference in Bogota, and some accounts claim Castro helped start riots. In fact, it was those riots that convinced Castro that masses were needed for a revolt. In 1950, he graduated and practiced law, then went on to publish short articles demanding justice for workers. After all this political activism, he decided a violent revolution was the only way to end Cuba's political corruption and economic dependence on the U.S. Castro's unsuccessful revolt of 1953 results in Castro being brought to trial. However, the trials gained fame and support. Castro's unsuccessful revolt of 1953 results in Castro being brought to trial. However, the trial gained fame and support since he defended himself and argued the revolt was justified. Additionally, in prison, he wrote a speech that was smuggled out in matchboxes and distributed. It was his manifesto for his revolution, and he gained attention because it entailed power to the people, redistribution of land, nationalizing public utilities, improving education, and diversifying the economy. And although the U.S. was not a direct aid to Castro and the Cubans, the New York Times, CIA, and U.S. in general gave their moral support. Basically, given Castro's political and economic nationalism and the traditional U.S. domination of Cuba's political and economic scene, this meant the U.S. and Cuba would face hostility, and it was inevitable.
Back and onto the next review question: how and why was Cuba important in the Cold War? Well, without the Cold War, a leftist revolution on a Caribbean island wouldn't really have made a global impact. But the Cold War context gave Cuba the opportunity to play a vital role in international relations. First, Cuba helped shape the Cold War in that it helped focus superpower attention on the importance of the Third World when it encouraged guerrilla movements in Latin America and revolutions in Africa. In the early months of the Cuban Revolution, small-scale expeditions were launched from Cuba against Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and Somoza in Nicaragua. Revolutionaries were also encouraged in Guatemala, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Argentina. Castro provided these guerrillas with financial aid, weapons, advice, and military training, and Cuban guerrillas often fought alongside the guerrillas in Argentina, Bolivia, and Venezuela. Although the Cuban Revolution was not initially a product of the Cold War, the continued existence of revolutionary Cuba owed much to the Cold War context and helped shape the course of this Cold War. Cuba was also important in the Cold War because of the tug-of-war it caused between the USSR and America. It's what intensified the Cold War. The U.S. supported invasion at the Bay of Pigs demonstrated the extent of American hostility to Castro and helped push him further under the Soviets' wing. The invasion increased Cuban nationalism and anti-Americanism, all of which served to reinforce his control and to help ensure the permanence of his revolution. The Bay of Pigs was a major trigger of the Cuban Missiles Crisis, prompting the USSR to put missiles on Cuba, inspiring Castro to agree to have them, and helping ensure Kennedy would stand firm on the removal of the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened when the USSR began building missile sites in Cuba in 1962. The Soviet Union withdrew the warheads in exchange for Kennedy pulling his own missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missiles Crisis of 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Civil War, and it was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict and possibly a World War III.
What was the significance of Castro's accession to power in Cuba? Additionally, with Castro's rise to power, he sought to destroy America's stranglehold over Cuba's economy, and when Cuba signed a trade agreement with the USSR, it was the start of a deteriorating alliance. After going back and forth, tensions rose between Cuba and the U.S., since the U.S. convinced other countries Cuba was communist despite its quote-unquote neutrality. Since the U.S. and Cuba fell out, this allowed the USSR and China to forge a trade agreement with Cuba, specifically over cane sugar, which was a huge market that the U.S. had once occupied as a buyer. Overall, his rise to power signified an important shift in alliances that persuaded Americans to view Cuba as communist, and it changed lives of Cubans, as they could finally get a grasp on their economy again.
That brings us to the final review question: how successful was the Cuban Revolution? All in all, Castro sought a fairer, more economically advanced Cuba, free from foreign domination, and was able to inspire those in other countries who were pursuing their own revolutions. The Cuban Revolution was successful to a great extent, as Castro aimed to end corrupt politics and the economic dominance of the USA, and to simply improve the lives of Cubans through equalization of wealth, free healthcare, better education, life improvement for women and blacks, the modernization of the sugar industry, freedom from U.S. domination, and by inspiring other Latin American revolutionaries. Ultimately, Castro was so successful because during the Cold War he put Cuba on the map, and he gave Cuban people a sense of national pride and achievement that was unheard of in the eras before him. And that's a wrap for the Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 prescribed content in the Cold War in the Americas book.